tonight is John Adams. He is, well, you can say he's kind of the co-host or partner of crime of Chris Kendall at Hoax Call. John, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, sir?
Hey, very good, very well. So, John, anything else you want to tell us about yourself, or is that good enough? Is that all you want the audience to know?
Yeah, you could go find out all about what Chris and I do over at hoaxbusterscall.com. We do a podcast called The Afternoon Commute, and we've been doing that for a little bit over 2 years now.
And I know that's kind of like where, it's usually runs anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. You just talk about any number of things. And, often it's based on what these phone calls that Chris makes, and whoever calls in, various guests and various topics, and whether it's conspiracy theory, the weird and wacky, the kind of like the weird things that really make up this world and how the world really works. So I do highly recommend that podcast, hoaxbusterscall.com. John, you've done some research regarding the music industry, particularly the punk rock scene. Many people who listen to this podcast, or people familiar with the alternative media, are familiar with Dave McGowan's research regarding Laurel Canyon and the scene there, the many connections between some of the premier rock acts of the 1960s, even the 70s, and their connections to military intelligence. So there's Jim Morrison and his father being Admiral Morrison, the one who commanded the fleet at the Gulf of Tonkin, Papa John Phillips, Frank Zappa, his father working at the Arsenal. What's the Arsenal again?
Edgewood.
Edgewood Arsenal, yeah. Joan Baez, it looks like her father was involved in MK Ultra at the university there, and she herself had claimed that she was ritualistically abused. Of course, we also have the research of Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill in the Grateful Dead, and the work that Time Life did in promoting psychedelic drugs as a part of MK Ultra with Life magazine, and how it coincided with the promotion of the whole drug scene of the 60s, sort of cultural programming. There's also evidence across the pond in England with Tavistock, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger having connections to London School of Economics. Same type of cultural programming, but you've done this with punk rock. And have you found similar connections, right, with this research?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually inspired by Dave. Unfortunately, he is passed away now. But I got to talk to him before he died and corresponded with him through email about some stuff that he put into his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which is a great book. I definitely recommend everybody go check that out. And, yeah, I was already into music. I know a great deal about music and music history and things like that. And it kind of surprised me that I had overlooked a lot of these connections that Dave pointed out in his research. And so I said to myself, I should probably go back and see if there's anything that I know that maybe someone else doesn't know. And it was interesting that I found a lot of connections right smack dab in the heart of Washington, D.C., of all places, pertaining to punk rock music, which, of course, is an anti-establishment, quote-unquote anti-establishment music scene, especially during the late 70s and the 1980s. So yeah, there was a anti-establishment stance, and when you go back and look at a lot of the stuff, even over in England, you're going to find very odd connections, and then very odd media attention, particularly paid to this quote-unquote anti-establishment movement.
So, what you found was a lot of these bands, I guess they presented themselves as, as you said, anti-establishment. They were, I guess you could say grassroots. They came from nothing. But you found a lot of these people came from affluent families, well-connected.
Yeah, very similar in nature to Laurel Canyon. In fact, one of the punk luminaries went to a naval academy called the Bullis School, where John Phillips went as well. So there is a connection there. There's also a strange connection, whereas Laurel Canyon was kind of this niche of people, this network of people who were all basically supported at some level, and it was this interlocked connecting network of the same people every time, down for 25 years. And you're going to find that with punk as well, especially coming out of the Washington, D.C. area, because strangely enough, we can get into it a little bit later, one of the biggest bands to ever come out of America, period, is connected to the scene, and that is the group Nirvana, is actually connected to the Washington, D.C. punk scene. And, if you want to get into some names and faces of this, it's around the late 70s, as you get into the early 80s, you start seeing punk as a quote-unquote philosophy. It's basically just postmodernism kind of masked in a anti-establishment degenerate type stance. And what I've seen I've seen multiple documentaries. I was even listening to this music back when I was young. I wouldn't call myself a punker or anything back then, but I definitely liked a lot of the music. And what you're going to find is a social engineering experiment, and a lot of families breaking up. I mean, if you go watch some of these old punk rock documentaries, you're actually going to see parents and children being interviewed about how this punk idea is breaking up their family, and it really isn't even the parents like laying the hammer down or anything. It's just that embedded into the songs and into the ideals of punk rock is hate your parents. That's what a lot of the songs are about. And so anyways, a lot of these guys who come out of this Washington, D.C. area, where you see this start of this particular branch of punk called hardcore punk, okay? And hardcore is a little bit more faster and a little bit more louder than the previous era of punk. And one of the bands that started around this time was a band called Minor Threat. And all of the guys in Minor Threat met each other at a prep school called the Georgetown Day School, right there across the street from Georgetown University. And so, interesting place for the punk icons to be meeting each other. If you saw the album cover of Minor Threat's album, you would think that these were kind of disheveled, lower-class kids. Turns out that's not the case, though. They were actually upper middle class, whose parents all worked in government, strangely enough, or at least something having to do with government. For instance, the lead singer, Ian MacKaye, his dad was a White House correspondent for the Washington Post, and at some point he up and moved his family to Palo Alto to get a degree at Stanford University, then moved back and became a religious expert for the Washington Post. So growing up listening to Minor Threat when, I was in 12, 13 years old, 14 years old, somewhere around there, that was not the impression that I got from them, that they were rich kids from Washington, D.C., whose parents were knee-deep in, the establishment that they were allegedly fighting against. Same thing with the drummer, Jeff Nelson, for Minor Threat, who is also Ian MacKaye's partner in the record label Discord Records. There's a book about Minor Threat and 12 other bands called Our Band Could Be Your Life, is written by a journalist named Michael Azarad. And there's just a brief little throwaway line in there, and you don't see this in any other biographical information about Mr. Jeff Nelson, and that is that Jeff Nelson was a State Department brat. And that's all you really know about his background, is that either one or two of his parents worked for the State Department, and yeah, that's it. There's not really much else biographical information out there about him personally. Mm-hmm. And so now you have a singer whose dad works for the Washington Post, which, I mean, we know that the Grahams are, CIA connected. And then you have a drummer who one or two of his parents worked for the State Department, which is another CIA outfit. You could kind of chalk this up to, whatever. But it's just very strange that these two gentlemen right there own a record label that, has a foundation on, being against the establishment. And it's based in Washington, D.C., and it's still running today. They still run that record label today, primarily only signing bands from the Washington, D.C. area. So it's a very fixed idea as to what it is, and they have no problem maintaining the anti-establishment stance right there in the heart of the establishment and with parents who are connected to it. Once again, this is kind of the same thing you see with Laurel Canyon, where you have these children of people who were in military intelligence and intelligence agencies creating the hippie movement, creating the whole idea of being anti-establishment. Some people tend to think, I think even Dave McGowan used to say that he thought it was to kind of do away with the idea of Vietnam War protests. I don't tend to think so personally. I think that the Vietnam War in and of itself and the protests were a method of creating upheaval of the culture here in America. So I think that whole thing was contrived from the start, and I think punk is an extension of that same thing, just to create upheaval within the culture.
Yeah, that was a while back I interviewed Chris Milligan of Trying Day Books, and that was his theory or belief of the Vietnam War was the division of the generations. You create trauma and you create a split between the generations, and you create incoherence within the community. And in fact, that's precisely, he claims that's what his father told him. His father was an old OSS hand, and said that the war was about opiating the public, the masses, the youth, and creating divisions between the generations. And that you can get into. That's gets into the corporate Madison Avenue Hollywood with with the development of the teenager of the 50s in movies and in marketing. And that's where these things intersect, because intelligence, marketing, whether it's the Pentagon or Hollywood, it's kind of one big complex, and they all cooperate in those endeavors. So even the universities,
absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. And if you go back and look, I mean, I've got Life magazines from the 1960s in my library. I've got magazines from Rolling Stone magazines from the 1980s. They promote punk. They promote the hippies. That whole thing was Madison Avenue intelligence agency from top to bottom. If you go into the old advertisements in all the magazines from back in the 60s, everything is, it's a gas, far out, flower power, all that stuff is incorporated into advertisement, which creates a cultural background for the generation. Whether you're actually a hippie or not is not the point. The point is that the culture is progressing and moving you through the time period and acclimating you to the to the new thing that is coming out. And the same thing with punk. You didn't have to be a punker during the late 70s or 80s to be aware that you were moving through this time period of cultural degrading, cultural degrade.
And that itself.
And
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, you go ahead. Pardon me.
Well, that itself is part of the strategy, because that's one way to, I guess, to blunt or to neutralize potential opposition to certain policies or cultural agendas. I just read an article about heroin chic in Berlin in the 1970s. David Bowie promoted that, and it was a time, the late 70s, when the Golden Triangle was shut down because the U.S. had withdrawn from Vietnam, and they were nurturing the new Golden Triangle, which was Afghanistan. This is the late 70s, and I think that's Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. And they're shipping the heroin in, and ironically, what happened is the youth, they're shipping the heroin into Central Europe, into Germany, to do that very thing, because at that time, this is the Cold War, and certain groups, leftist groups, were very popular among the German youth. And this is, again, how you opiate them and neutralize them with heroin, and how you get them to pay for your black ops, because the money they're buying the heroin, which pays for your black ops over there in Central Asia.
Yeah, another element of the 60s that we're not aware of too much, but which actually leads into the punk scene, is the heroin chic of the late 1960s, or the mid to late 1960s, involved with the modern art movement, and which we know that to be an intelligence operation in and of itself, cultural intelligence. You could read that in The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders, which is a whitewash book, but with lots of great information in it. And so, you have this modern art movement, Andy Warhol, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, and then the house band at Warhol's factory was the Velvet Underground. And the Velvet Underground had a song called Heroin that would later be covered by Nirvana. And so the heroin chic was big, was a big deal. Mainly on the East Coast, it was kind of while it was hippies and love out here, it was kind of heroin and darkness over on the East Coast. But the Velvet Underground for a long time was a house band at a place called Max's Kansas City, where all of the big rock bands used to, when they come into New York, that's where they'd go hang out at. And the band that took over for them after they stopped that housebound stint was the New York Dolls. And the New York Dolls were a bunch of straight guys who dressed up like transvestites. Sound familiar? 1980s metal, right?
Yeah.
This was being done in that. Yeah, this was being done in the 70s. And so at the same time, in England, you brought up Bowie, at the same time in England, there was the glam rock, androgynous rock star thing with Bowie, T-Rex, bands like Sweet, Mott the Hoople, Slade. This was all predates the 80s hair metal stuff where the guys were, wearing lipstick and eyeshadow. This was all being done in the 70s, not only in New York, but also in Great Britain. And this was a precursor to the stuff that we are now seeing being forcefully implemented into society, having to do with transgenderism and whatnot. This is really one of the precursors to it culturally. And yeah, David Bowie was a cross-dressing alien in being Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah, and his marginal talent, just a lot of the music was engineered in the studio, which was also a hallmark of that era. Overproduced music.
Oh yeah.
So
he could hire really good musicians to do it.
Which is
to do all of the stuff.
Which is very much like Laura Canyon, with the Wrecking Crew and.
Oh, the Wrecking Crew is the Wrecking Crew is a phenomenal group of musicians. Mm-hmm. There's actually solo records from a lot of those guys that are jazz music. It's all jazz music. Like, those guys are all super talented. In fact, most people don't know this, but one of the Wrecking Crew guitar players was Glenn Campbell.
Oh, yeah.
From the Rhinestone Cowboy fame. Well, when Glenn Campbell wasn't busy being a pop star, he was a session musician. And so, yeah, when you hear those Monkey records, when you hear those Birds, Mamas and the Papas, all that stuff, it's all manufactured in the studio. It's all with people who really know what they're doing. It's not to say that the Birds themselves didn't actually learn how to play a little bit later on. They did, but when you hear stories about the Birds playing live, mostly people said they were terrible. Yeah, and that's not only from I'm not getting that only from McGowan's book. I actually read a book about Jane Fonda, and apparently Jane Fonda's Malibu Beach House was one of the first places they played, and they said everybody was outside because it sounded so bad.
Well, yeah, they got this immediate, recording contract, I think from Columbia. I think it was the label that signed them. And of course, you had people like David Crosby in the band who never exhibited any real talent at all, right? And he was,
and honestly, the Birds, the later era of the Birds is one of my favorite groups because what they did is they actually got their session musician guys to become part of the band.
Yeah,
that's how you do it. Is you just hire those guys to become the actual band itself, and they actually sounded really good. But yeah, the early records of the Birds it's very good, but the live stuff leaves you wanting, to say the least.
Yeah, they sang Bob Dylan songs, and they didn't record them in the studio. So,
yeah, it's an interesting thing about Bob Dylan. I mean, he really didn't even have to record songs himself because everybody under the sun was covering his songs, and I mean, he wasn't really that wildly popular in the pop realm until that started happening. He was mostly only popular in the folk realm, but then once the record companies, for whatever reason, decided to promote Bob Dylan because, well, what does Bob Dylan sing about? Well, the times they're changing, and it's time to get rid of that old way of doing things and bring in this new way, and the youth know what they're talking about, and the old fuddy-duddy old people don't know what you're talking about. So that was the mantra of the day.
Now, we see that, and of course, the popular music, and really, it's not too surprising that, popular music being big business, it is show business, that would be different than what we see on stage, but there's something more to it than that because we have these characters, they claim they're coming off the streets, they're poor, but really they come from affluent families, and they all come from almost to a person from ties to military and intelligence. And when you say people who working at the State Department, just because it's the State Department doesn't mean you're not intelligent. So people who are savvy to how intelligence works is those various bureaucracies are full of intelligence operatives. They're sheep dipped, and they work in these various agencies undercover. So just because they were State Department employees doesn't mean they were children of diplomats. So, but
it's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up because I was gonna, one of Ian MacKaye from Minor Threat's best friends was a guy named Henry Garfield, and that's a very prestigious last name there, coming out of Washington. And Mr. Garfield, he was the son of a Navy man, and in some accounts, he's a Navy man who disciplined Henry with his fists. And Henry claims in other interviews that he was sexually molested and sexually assaulted as a young boy. And then in other interviews, his dad was an economist. So if you put all this together, he was a sexually abusing Navy man who was also an economist. I don't know what position an economist has in the Navy, but maybe that was after the Navy. I'm not too sure. But Henry went to a naval academy that I mentioned earlier called the Bullis Academy, where Papa John Phillips also attended. And after he attended the Bullis School, which he still claims is where he learned a lot of his discipline. And Henry was not a drinker or a smoker or anything like that. He was into clean living, as he put it. And which is interesting considering the punk rock, one of the ethos of punk rock is to basically do drugs and drink and everything that would, be bad. Mm-hmm. And so Henry was not like that, and neither was Ian MacKaye from Minor Threat. And apparently those guys, their entire lives have been clean, never touching any of those substances. Which good for them. I'm glad. But Henry, after he went to this Bullis Academy, he attended the American University. And if you just go look that up, you can see all of the luminaries and media figureheads and diplomats that attended the American University. It is by no way just a small town university. This is like they have a school of foreign affairs at the American University. After that, he worked at the National Institute of Health in some position, and then after going to this academy, this university, and then working at the National Institute of Health, he decided he was going to become a punk rocker and work at Haagen-Dazs, scooping ice cream. And so then he became he got some street cred after that, got some tattoos, got in a couple of fights, and became known as a punk rock wild man with his band State of Alert. Now, you brought up the word diplomat, so this is what jogged my memory, is that he was in this band State of Alert. They actually used to practice on the Annapolis Naval Base. So this anti-establishment band would have their band practices on the naval base. That's where the vice president lives, by the way. So they were no threat, apparently. And the drummer, his name was Ivor Hansen. His dad was, according to a biographical article, was top Navy brass. That's what it said his dad was. He was the son of some top Navy brass. And he went on to actually marry a lady who is a diplomat for the United Nations. Because that's what, downtrodden punk rock people do. is they marry United Nations diplomats. And if you know anything about how a lot of these people work, they only marry within each other's, circles. That's how they meet each other. I mean, you're not going to be a UN diplomat and marry some dirty punk rock kid. It's just, it doesn't sound it doesn't even sound probable to me just saying it right now.
Well, that's what they call it, like the intelligence community, right?
Yes, it is. Anytime you go look up a lot of this stuff, like take for instance, like Al Gore's daughter is married to a Carnegie Mellon. Dennis Hopper was married to Brooke Hayward, who was the daughter of Leland Hayward, and Leland Hayward was at one time married to Claire Booth Luce. You see, who was the wife of Henry Luce, the guy who put out Time Life magazine. So these people marry amongst each other. It's not just, random chance, that type of stuff. And so anyways, getting back to Henry Garfield, Henry Garfield joined a band called Black Flag, and he became famous after joining this band Black Flag, and he changed his name from Henry Garfield to Henry Rollins, which we all know him now as a journalist, a political activist, an actor, sometimes musician, and spoken word poet, a left-winger, of course, because that's another thing that goes along with being a punk rocker is you got to be left-wing. There are no There are no right-wing punkers for some reason, except for Johnny Ramone from the guitar player from the Ramones. He was actually the only right-wing punker I've ever heard of.
So, why the name change from Garfield to Rollins? Was the marketing thing, or is there?
He said that when he was on stage, he had a stage persona, and his stage persona was Rollins, but it wasn't Henry Garfield. So, do with that information what you want. I'm going to leave that ambiguous. But yeah, he had a stage persona called Rollins. That's what he said. And yeah, like I said, a lot of the other guys in this band, Minor Threat, there's a movie from 2006. It's called American Hardcore, and they interview the guitar player from the band. His name is Brian Baker, and he doesn't have a background. Another one of these guys where you can't find out anything about his parents or his background. He went to the Georgetown Day School, and then he became the guitar player in Minor Threat. And then they choose him, of all people, to give this line in this movie where he says, this is what he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, but you can go watch the movie and know that it's pretty much the same thing that he's quoted. He said, you know, everybody who lives in Washington, D.C. works in the government in one way or another, so naturally the children in the punk rock scene would be the children of people in the government. It was just kind of a throwaway line there. Another guy who's interesting is a band that was on Ian MacKay's record label, Discord Records, is the band Marginal Man, and their guitar player, I think he was, his name was Kenny Inouye. And Kenny Inouye is the son of the former head of the Democratic, the head of the Senate, I think he was, Daniel Inouye from Hawaii. And Daniel Inouye was a big-time insider, especially if you go back and watch. He was the head of the Iran-Contra hearings. So, yeah, this guy who was the head of the Iran-Contra hearings, his son was in an anti-establishment punk band.
Yeah, he was the one when Jack Brooks brought up Rex 84. Insisted
That's right.
That it be discussed in executive session and not in public. Yeah, so that was, anyway. This is the type of topic that was brought up in an executive session. And Jack, Brooks.
He has a very deep voice. This is the type of topic we should talk about in executive session.
National security is at stake, isn't it? By God.
Yeah. It's a hilarious clip.
Now, you said there are connections that we have the punk rock scene. Again, we have these. I guess, not inexplicable, but curious connections to government, intelligence, State Department, UN stuff. Basically, these punk rockers, they're playing a role. They're not what they claim to be. They're not the genuine thing. They're a bunch of affluent kids who apparently were placed there for some reason. And it has a connection to West Coast, the grunge scene.
Yeah, in a couple of different ways. So two people to come out of this Washington, D.C. punk scene and then migrate to Washington State, Olympia, Tacoma. There is a college out there. I tend to think that there are certain colleges that are spook colleges. And I know a lot. I know that there's probably spooks in every college, but there's all these colleges where they have these very interesting things going on. And one of those is Evergreen College in Olympia, Washington. And this is primarily where the grunge, which, Seattle is not too far away, the grunge scene and what was called the Riot Girl scene comes out of there. And two people who moved from Washington, D.C., being in the Washington, D.C. punk scene, were Dave Grohl, who is now a very famous, for his band, the Foo Fighters, but at one time was the drummer for Nirvana, but he was also in he was also in a Washington, D.C. punk band called Dane Bramage, and I think he was in another band called Scream. He became part of the band Nirvana. And then a woman named Kathleen Hanna is also from that Washington, D.C. scene and then moved out there. And when she moved out there, she was not Dave Grohl's girlfriend when she lived in Maryland, but she was Dave Grohl's girlfriend when they lived in Olympia. And so this band that she headed up was called Bikini Kill. And she is regarded as an icon of third wave feminism. Okay, so she's said in multiple interviews that her mom was taking her to see Gloria Steinem speak when she was 9 years old, and she, had pictures of Gloria Steinem on her wall, and someone might have pictures of Led Zeppelin, or maybe some girl might have a picture of New Kids on the Block or something back then. She had pictures of Gloria Steinem. So she was all into feminism at an early age, allegedly. And, so she becomes this kind of poster girl for third-wave feminism.
Now, Steinem herself was a CIA asset, and she admits that now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
And there's not many out there that you can't find a connection to either intelligence or, like the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation, which those are intelligence fronts already. I guess you say the reverse. Intelligence is a front for the Rockefellers.
Yeah, it's an agency acting on behalf of these corporate, oligarchic interests. Yeah.
Right, and so that's why McGeorge Bundy, who was Skull and Bones CIA, went on to be the head of the Ford Foundation later after his tenure as an agent. So these people move out there, and then this scene starts to build up, this grunge scene. And it's interesting that this grunge scene is kind of coming into view right as what you would call alternative music is kind of taking the place of punk. And this alternative sphere starts popping up. You start seeing shows on MTV about this word alternative gets thrown around, and still today that word remains in our lexicon. Alternative lifestyles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So alternative music was an alternative to the mainstream. That's how it's always sold. They give you a dialectic. It's like you're either mainstream or you're alternative, but both are owned by the same big corporations selling you. If you don't like the the stuff mom and pop like, we've got this other stuff here for you. It's a little bit risky,
Yeah, they have entire music festivals dedicated to alternative music.
Sure. Alternative and punk, and it's all commercial. Even if you think it's not commercialized, like some people think, like, oh yeah, man, punk used to be really good until it went commercial. It's like, no, it was always commercial. It was always, all those bands were always on major labels. They were never, there wasn't any of the biggest bands out there were on major labels. And if they weren't, they were on smaller labels like Discord Records, who obviously were allowed to proliferate. And so once you get into this grunge thing and this Riot Girl scene, you really start to see kind of things take off. And then connected to this is, once again, Ian MacKaye, because he started another band after Minor Threat a little bit later on called Fugazi. And he started it with another guy who attended the Georgetown Day School. And he started it with a bass player who used to work at NASA.
That's like Jeff Skunk Baxter, right? Rocket scientist, Steely Dan.
Oh, Jeff Skunk Baxter.
Yeah,
he worked for. He was in Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers. Yeah, he's a really good guitar player.
Oh yeah.
But so you got these guys who I can't remember I can't remember where the singer of Fugazi went to school, but he went to actually went to Georgetown University. Not that that means anything, but it's, I mean, if someone said, "Oh, I went to Georgetown University," I wouldn't necessarily say they were a spook. I would just say, well, if you were in a band with a bunch of other guys who are connected to spooks and you went to Georgetown, then you might be a spook.
Yeah.
And so this whole alternative music scene kind of blossoms. This grunge and alternative become kind of synonymous. And at one time, actually, alternative bands were a little bit different than grunge. It wasn't exactly the same thing. A lot of these bands might not have any connections to anything whatsoever, but all you need to do is kick off the culture. You need to create the culture, and then the creative aspect of humans who like something, that becomes the thing that people like about it. That becomes the thing that you're able to market and sell. And so a lot of times what you see with this type of stuff is these people kick off these scenes, and then these scenes take on a life of their own. That's, within a controlled realm. It's like putting a mouse in a snake cage, with a snake.
Mm-hmm.
And the snake eats the hamster. Whatever is gonna, you put the mouse in the snake cage, and whatever happens after that, you don't really have any control over. But it's still taking place inside of the cage.
Yeah,
and that's how
confines of the plan. Yeah.
Right, and that's how culture works too. It's like you have an idea. You say this idea is going to divide generations. It's going to destroy old ideas and old norms. And there's going to be actual real creativity from people that come out of this changing of the guard, this postmodernism. But it's all going to be within a controlled paradigm that we control. And so
out of chaos order, right?
Yeah, controlled chaos. Yeah. And so once again, all sorts of weird stuff with that band Nirvana.
And
to me,
Nirvana, we think of.
Oh, go ahead.
So Nirvana, we think of the head man, right?
Kurt Cobain,
who committed suicide with a shotgun that he couldn't have done it with, and with heroin that was 5 times what anyone could have taken, so he simply would have been incapacitated. His wife, Courtney Love, she has connections to Intel and military, and also to the Presidio, and some of the things that went on out there. So it all gets into this sort of this MK Ultra trauma-based mind control thing. But her father, Hank Harrison, if I'm correct, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
He has connections to intelligence, correct?
I don't remember.
I thought because he's the one that changed the Warlocks to the Grateful Dead, I think, and he was always described as a man.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah, that is correct. Yes.
And of course, the Grateful Dead links to Pagan Melly Hitchcock and the mansion over there in New York, and the promotion of LSD, and I think the Grateful Dead
are yeah, they're a terrible band.
They were. That's right. It's just kind of like very.
I mean, they're just terrible musicians.
Yeah. And I think
I think
Jerry Garcia was AWOL or something, and they never went after him.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean,
and they were in Watts, so the riot started. Right. I think
they've been everywhere. Yeah.
I think their manager was it Brian Hunter. His father was one of the founders of Tavistock, which is interesting, if I have that right. And my name's
Yeah, some of that stuff again, I don't remember all of it, but yeah, I mean, the Grateful Dead. When I first heard that the Grateful Dead was connected to intelligence. And actually one of the first places I heard that was in that ridiculous book, Acid Dreams, by Bruce Lane and Martin Lee. And I was reading that book. And thinking that this book is such a whitewash, it's unbelievable. But they talk about the dead a little bit in there. I'm like, oh, this makes total sense. The dead were drug dealers for Owsley.
Yeah, Owsley Stanley, or Stanley Owsley, or Owsley Stanley, yeah.
So I mean, that
came from a really wealthy family, right? He was a scion or some.
Yeah, he was too. And then when you find out that Bob Weir goes to Bohemian Grove,
yeah, he praised them all.
You know. So, yeah, well, I mean, whatever about that. I just, you know, he goes and hangs out with a bunch of Republicans when he's in the Grateful Dead. I mean,
yeah.
You know, so the thing about Kurt Cobain is I don't believe he actually died. I've never actually seen any evidence that he died. I think it's a psyop. I think what you do is you fake the death of one of your generation's biggest icons, which causes trauma and trauma-based mind control through media and propaganda. Once again, MK Ultra, as far as I've looked at it, it's cultural trauma-based mind control. When it comes to assassins and things like that, I don't believe that there's MK Ultra assassins. I think that there's MK Ultra mind control through the culture itself. The culture itself is MK Ultra mind control. I think that there's, you know, mind control sex slaves and things like that. But as far as the assassinations and trying to control somebody, to mind control them to go kill somebody, it seems like a very risky situation if you wanted to get that job done. You know, when you could just pay a sane assassin to go do it with all of his brain intact.
Yeah, maybe it could be a patsy program where they just show up, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't at the Robert Kennedy assassination. I don't know what actually went on there. I don't know if he actually died or if he didn't, but Sirhan looks like a patsy who's been, you know, sitting in jail. Obviously, I've never seen him in jail, so I don't know, but I just tend to think that he probably is in jail for something that either didn't happen or that he didn't do. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing with Kurt Cobain. What this does is it creates a trauma within the youth. They lose their friend, they lose their icon, they lose the person who wrote all of this, you know, poetry that they connected with. And
yeah, this idea of the icon goes back to Edward Bernays, right? And he's tried to recreate the Greek pantheon of the gods for the masses. And
sure. Yeah, I mean, he did that with the ballet. What's the ballet star?
Well, he did with Enrico Caruso, who was the
Caruso, yeah.
And Rudolph Valentino was another one. I don't know if that was directly Edward Bernays. It was the same phenomenon. But the whole cult of celebrity, I think, is all part of, you know, you could say it's a branch or sub-project of MK Ultra, because that just corporatized MK Ultra, I think. It's there to, and all the aspirational, you know, programming we see with the lifestyles of rich and famous, or every time you go online and you say, look inside, you know, Jennifer Aniston's amazing mansion or something. You know, all this.
Yeah, it's a bizarre world. I mean, I was just at a birthday party this weekend, and you know, it was people my age. I'm 38. They were all 38 or 40 years old, and I mean, everybody. I couldn't really have a conversation with anybody because they were literally just talking about movie stars the whole time. And I was, even if I wanted to, I don't know anything about that stuff, so I couldn't.
We should have stepped in there. Hey, you know, Cary Grant was a pedophile? What?
Oh, they wouldn't even know who Cary Grant was.
Oh, I know, that's a sad thing. Who's Cary Grant?
Yeah, they don't. You know, that's another thing that all this postmodernist.
That's the generational stuff, right? Where someone from a generation doesn't have to know what happened before they were born.
Oh yeah, people have no idea. They don't know anything. I mean, people barely know who the Beatles are.
I know.
You know,
When I was a kid, I knew who Al Jolson was. You know,
yeah,
I was that culturally aware. I realized, you know, it was, who Groucho Marx was. I knew who the Marx Brothers were.
sure,
A lot of kids, you make these references and like, who? Well, it wasn't like he was around when I was alive, or Groucho Marx was alive, but he was well past his prime when I was a kid. But like, no, it's no understanding your history and your culture, knowing where things came from. And you do realize there was a planet before you were born, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah. It's getting worse, and the thing about that is like, I'm not so concerned that someone knows who Groucho Marx is. The thing is, and I know you're thinking the same way I do. It's that people are disconnected from the past, so they don't even know anything about what happened before a certain time period. And what you'll actually find with people is that they don't even remember what happened a week ago.
yes.
And it's all very momentary. And this is actually, I've brought up the word postmodernism quite a bit, and Chris and I have done a whole series on the Southern California and how that's a laboratory for culture, especially modernism and postmodernism. And what that does is it's a fracturing method. And
It's very interesting. Can
it
you expand on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, it fractures culture. What it does, it breaks it up, and through modernism, what you do is you do away with traditionalism entirely. You say, okay, no more ornamentation on architectural structures. This has to function as a building and only a building. We don't want any ornamentation on there. And I'm just using this as an example because this is a philosophy of modernism that carries over through all elements of culture, whether it be art or music or, dinnerware, dishes. Okay, so it's gotta have a function. And then at a certain point, somebody says, well, this doesn't really have to have a function either. It's just kind of got to be this blob, this mishmash of something where it has no reference point. And you'll see a lot of architecture like that today, where it has no, you have no reference point to it. It's like a mishmash of Moorish arches with Spanish modernism, with American modernism, with European, all of this stuff mishmash. It's like a multicultural building, right? And
yeah.
It's very ugly. It's not something you can relate to, and I think people are aware of this because they used to have certain things that they could fall back on culturally, to kind of have a reference point, right? And so even the modernism that replaced the traditionalism in the starting in the 20s and all the way up into the 1960s, when the postmodernism came in, it shattered all of that modernism that people had come to rely on as a cultural background. People don't realize how first of all, they don't realize that they live in a culture. They're not aware of their culture. It's like, fish swimming in water. They're not aware of the water. Second of all, people don't realize that there is cultural wallpaper. And those things that arise as you're growing up in a generation are things that you psychically fall back on, that you can rely on to be there. And it's very hard to break away and see that those things are manufactured for you. The music you like, the television shows, all of that stuff is your culture. And then for you to actually step away and recognize that has all been presented to you and you've been programmed through it to like it. It's like with all the music that I've studied. I had to come to a point to where I had to say, you know what, this is not a part of me. This is me externalizing my power over to this thing called music. I need to take that back. I need to, like the music, but not have the music be a part of my internal makeup. And that's what people need to realize. But most people don't realize it. And then when those things are shattered and you're given something new, it's culture shock.
Yeah, that was. I mean, it's getting a little far afield here, but I've always wondered if that was the primary objective of some of the bombings of World War II, destroying these old German cities, getting rid of Dresden, getting rid of Hamburg.
Absolutely.
These cities that were 1,000 years old, and Florence on the Elbe, and you destroy all that art, all those old churches.
See, take a reverse look at that. You have to look at what World War II did to America. World War II totally changed America from what it used to be prior to World War II. See, we didn't used to be a war-based economy. We didn't have an economy based solely on aerospace engineering and making missiles and bombs and, plane shuttles that allegedly fly people up into the outer realms of space, allegedly. These are all things that changed America as a result of World War II. So whereas you changed the culture of Germany by blowing up all of those old things, you also change the culture of America simultaneously. Every time you go to war, your culture changes. The attacker is just as changed culturally as the attackee.
Yeah, it is a massive social engineering project.
It is. War is not so much about bombs as it is about cultural bombs and social engineering.
And of course, in the process of mobilizing for war, the social engineers at the Office of War Information and the OSS got together with the universities, like University of Chicago, to devise a plan to break up the old ethnic enclaves and create suburbia, working in conjunction with with the CIA and General Motors, also this corporate. Because the first person who oversaw the construction of the interstate highway system, was the head of General Motors.
That's right. And what's interesting about that, I'll add this too, if you weren't aware of this, but allegedly the interstate highway system was built to facilitate the military in case of communists coming to get us, right? Yeah. That's actually not true. And here's the reason why. It was actually built to make it easier for the suburbs and the city to intertwine with each other. That was the real reason behind it, because when they built these interstates, the freeways and the freeway overpasses were not built big enough to get missile launchers through.
Yeah.
Okay, so if they were planning on, running all this, military stuff through these highways and all that type of stuff, they weren't tall. The interstates themselves were not built tall enough to even get a missile launcher through there. So there's no way that could have been the reason. The reason was suburbia itself and the interstate highway system connecting the cities with the suburbs was the primary goal. Suburbia was more on tradition.
Yes, and there's breaking up the ethnic enclaves, particularly the Catholic neighborhoods, and also to create a perpetual debt slavery, because it's the 30-year mortgage, right?
Absolutely.